Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest installment of the Compassion and Social Justice Lecture Series. This is our fifth lecture in the series, and my name is Jody Sider-Jones, and I'm the Corporate Director for Mission Engagement and Reconciliation with Providence Healthcare. I'm pleased to be your moderator today. Fiona Dalton, President and CEO of Providence Healthcare, was scheduled to moderate this event. However, an unexpected and urgent meeting has come up, and I'd like to pass along a welcome on her behalf. And to get things started, I'd like to begin in a good way and acknowledge with gratitude that I am joining this virtual gathering today from St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is located on the unceded ancestral and traditional homelands of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. As a settler and visitor on these territories, and in my personal commitment towards truth and reconciliation, I'm grateful personally for the sovereign host nations for their generations-long stewardship of these lands. And I'm grateful to collaborate towards Indigenous healing and wellness and to live, work, and serve on these vibrant and beautiful lands. And so for today's event, we are joined by over 130 people from across British Columbia and across Canada. So welcome. Thank you for joining us here today. This lecture series is rooted in our institution's mission-driven commitments to compassion and social justice. These Catholic faith-based institutions in the partnership are Providence Healthcare, St. Paul's Hospital Foundation, St. Mark's College at the University of British Columbia, and the Archdiocese of Vancouver. And true to Catholic tradition, the goal of these lectures is to advance knowledge and practice in healthcare, and particularly in the areas of healthcare ethics and discernment. These lectures engage in this way by drawing focus towards the human person who is suffering in all of their intrinsic dignity, and by learning from all health-related disciplines, including theology. So in today's lecture, we will explore the ethics, motivations, and obstacles of being a good Samaritan. It's a resonant and thought-provoking topic, and it will delve into individual experiences as well as themes around the common good and community-level responses, to name a few. So now just a quick couple of housekeeping notes for you before we really get into things. This webinar is being recorded, but only the presenters visible on the screen are recorded. As viewers, you are not on the camera and you will remain automatically muted throughout the presentation. This lecture features two speakers whom I will introduce shortly, and our presenters will provide their perspectives together, back and forth, for the first 30 minutes, and then we will move to question and answer conversation. So all of you, everyone joining us, can ask a question by tapping the question and answer tab on the right side of your screen. And please submit your questions as you think of them. You don't have to wait until the question and answer has started. And you can also vote up by clicking the questions other people ask. So with that bit of housekeeping done, let us begin with a welcome from His Grace, Archbishop J. Michael Miller of the Archdiocese of Vancouver.
Hello, my name is Michael Miller, and it's my pleasure to serve as the Archbishop of Vancouver. I'm privileged to be speaking to you from the John Paul II Pastoral Centre on these unceded, traditional, and ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Today I have the honor of welcoming you to the second year of programming for the Compassion and Social Justice Lecture Series, a partnership supported by the Archdiocese of Vancouver between Providence Healthcare, St. Mark's College at UBC, and the St. Paul's Hospital Foundation. This partnership has one goal: to advance healthcare ethics through scholarly initiatives, formation, and service. Grounded in the tradition of Catholic healthcare, which is over 125 years old in BC, this partnership seeks new and exciting opportunities, like these virtual lectures. We hope to bring people together with experts in ethics and other related healthcare fields for learning and discussion. In this second year of the lecture series, the focus moves to Jesus' gospel parable of the Good Samaritan. This theme is extraordinarily important to our ministry in healthcare as we navigate these complex and troubling times. The Good Samaritan calls us to work together with all people of goodwill to build a healthier society, one grounded in solidarity and in justice for all. Thank you for joining this virtual lecture for the care you offer professionally or personally every day to those in need of your accompaniment. Now, sit back, listen, engage, and enjoy today's lecture. May God bless you.
What a wonderful welcome and invitation for all of us, and many thanks to His Grace for his generous support of these lectures and for sharing this message with us today. So today's theme is A Neighbor's Helping Hand, a discussion in ethics, motivation, and obstacles of being a Good Samaritan. And we'll look at this through the lens of the experience of sudden cardiac arrest occurring at home or in the community and the impact that a bystander's actions may have. For those of you who are familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan, the message is as relevant today as it was more than 2,000 years ago. It is within us, each and every one of us, to be a Good Samaritan. We are called to help those in need. When the unexpected situation arises and a person is rendered vulnerable, we have the opportunity to see the person and recognize the need, to show compassion, to act in a selfless way, to ameliorate suffering, and to render aid to the extent of our abilities, and to act in solidarity and with humanity. It's the ultimate story of social justice. Today's guests come from different perspectives, one from a medical clinical perspective and the other from a theologian academic perspective. They're part of a team working together on CanSave, and they will talk about that to great extent, so I won't give you any more details here. It is a national collaborative out of the University of British Columbia, which is transforming the response to sudden cardiac arrest through integrating expertise, including medicine, engineering, and the social sciences, and the lived experiences of survivors across Canada. The vision and outcome of this work is to have the best survival rates from sudden cardiac arrest through transformative research in the areas of recognition, response, and recovery. Our presenters will be working together today, so I'm pleased to introduce both of them now. Starting the presentation off after a brief introduction from the other presenter will be Dr. Jim Christensen. So Dr. Jim Christensen is an emergency physician at St. Paul's Hospital here in Vancouver and was appointed as professor and head of the academic department of emergency medicine at UBC in September of 2010 and held that position until December of 2020. He has served as the vice president for medical programs for the BC Emergency and Health Services Commission, where he embraced the challenge of optimizing care in the pre-hospital emergency setting. Dr. Christensen's keen interest in the best clinical practice during resuscitation motivated his involvement in the CPR guidelines process, and his extensive volunteer work with the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada and the American Heart Association. Dr. Christensen is also the principal investigator for the BC Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium that has been involved in various aspects of cardiac arrest and trauma research for 25 years. It's worth noting that as a result of an active focus on the quality of resuscitation, the chance of survival from an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest in British Columbia has risen from 6.6% in 2006 to 15% in 2016, more than doubling. So these improved outcomes mean that every year, let's get this straight, 150 more British Columbians survive sudden unexpected death than just a few years ago. Through his work, Dr. Christensen is committed to further increases in survival through improvements in the pre-hospital resuscitation and post-resuscitation phases of care across British Columbia. And co-presenting with Dr. Christensen is Scott Klein, who holds a PhD in Christian social ethics. Scott is the inaugural visiting scholar in ethics at Providence Healthcare and St. Mark's College at the University of British Columbia. This position is a collaboration to provide joint teaching, learning, and healthcare delivery by enhancing learning opportunities in ethics through clinical, experiential learning, academic research, and teaching at St. Paul's Hospital and St. Mark's College. Scott has extensive academic teaching experience and is an established theologian and researcher. In addition to his research with Dr. Christensen, he is researching the role of faith-based organizations in systems approaches to homelessness, which he conducts with his wife, Dr. Megan Shore. So before the presentation begins, it's important for me to let you know that there will be a short video showing a genuine real-life cardiac arrest that will be shown within the presentation. And this may be a trigger for some. You will get advance notice from the speaker before it plays, and if you choose, you can turn down or turn away from your screen for the roughly 1 minute video. So now, I'd like to invite Jim and Scott to share their presentation, and I think, Scott, it's over to you. Is that right?
Yes, thanks, Jody. Just before we get into material, I do want to say my own words of thanks to the institutions that have supported this talk: Providence Healthcare, St. Paul's Foundation, and St. Mark's College. I also want to thank Archbishop Miller for supporting this endeavor, as well as supporting the establishment of the visiting scholar in ethics. It is certainly my honor and privilege to be the inaugural scholar here, and so far it's been an absolutely wonderful year in spite of all of our COVID challenges. So I do look forward to talking with you this afternoon on the topic of a neighbor's helping hand and the Good Samaritan. And with those introductory words on my part, I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Jim Christensen. It's all yours, Jim.
Thank you very much, Scott. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I really thank the organizers and thank Scott in particular for inviting me. It is a true honor, and I'd like to thank you all in the audience for actually taking time out of your busy days to come and join with us in this topic. Sudden cardiac death is an epidemic, and it's an epidemic with an extremely high mortality rate. But it's also an epidemic that can be impacted and increase survival if we can integrate lay people into our healthcare system. And it is, the science supports that. And where we're going now is to try to make sure that we can optimize the integration of everyday citizens into a rapid response to somebody with sudden cardiac death. So let's get going. So what is sudden cardiac death? Well, it's called by various names. It's called out of hospital cardiac arrest. It's called cardiac arrest. It's called, I think the best name for it that's really helps to explain it is sudden unexpected cardiac death. It is not the same as a heart attack. So a heart attack happens when the blood supply to a portion of your heart muscle gets obstructed and you get chest pain. And you might have some irregularities in the ability of your heart to function, but for the most part, your heart doesn't stop beating. It keeps trying to beat. If you get to hospital with that, the mortality is very, very low, more like 4%. When you have a cardiac arrest, it means that the heart stops beating, blood stops flowing to your vital organs. And it takes only seconds for you to become unconscious. And it can't be overestimated about what that really means. So some people describe it as being a really important critical event that is fatal unless action is taken quickly. I think that actually minimizes it. I mean, it sounds dramatic maybe to some, but I think it minimizes it. Because as a physician, that patient at that time, moments after their heart has stopped beating, they are clinically dead. And so that's why we call it sudden cardiac death. And it confuses some people because then we talk about survival from death. And it's something that we have to get our heads around to say, this person has just died. And if we act quickly, we can actually reverse death and bring them back to life, hopefully with good neurologic outcomes. Now, what does that look like? This is where we're going to show you a video. It's just over a minute. It's an actual cardiac event, cardiac arrest, I should say, an unexpected cardiac death from about 10 years ago. It was in Portland. And so if you think you'll have an extreme emotional response to this, then please just look away. There'll just be music playing. You won't really hear any sounds that would be triggering, I don't think. But let's just start that with those of you who want to turn away, please do so at this point. Now we'll just play it and just watch. So what you saw there was an actual cardiac arrest. And I think what you would have noted would be that when this patient or victim had his arrest, it happened very suddenly. He happened to be sitting in a chair and his head just went back. And his blood had stopped flowing and he quickly became unconscious. And then I hope what you also saw was that his office mates acted in an exemplary fashion very quickly to call the ambulance service and to start doing CPR. It is because of their actions that the defibrillation that was applied when the paramedics got there was successful. And this patient had a very good outcome, survived neurologically intact to continue his life. And it's important to know that CPR is something that we want to emulate in every cardiac arrest if we can. But bystanders can actually do the defibrillation that in this case you saw performed by professionals. And that's another way that in fact we can improve survival, because the earlier CPR is performed and the earlier defibrillation is performed, the greater the chance of survival. And defibrillators, you may know or may not know, are very, very easy to use for lay people. Now, that was in a non-home setting. And I guess I'd like to say that there's lots of variations on that theme. That was a well-controlled setting. But you can imagine that sudden cardiac death can happen when you're out hiking, just going for a walk, going to the grocery store. You can be standing and you fall down. You can be riding your bicycle. It can happen. And so all sorts of things around that event might look extremely different. But the majority of cardiac arrests happen at home. And of those arrests that happen at home, 3/4 of them are unwitnessed. The patient lives alone. The patient might be in a different room. Often it's at nighttime during sleep that cardiac arrest happens, and nobody notices until it's far too late. When the loved ones in the home are actually aware that a cardiac arrest has occurred, the reactions are also different to being in a public place where it's a stranger and people are encouraged to act and try to save the life of someone that they don't know. When it's something that somebody who you know and who's really integral to your whole life, you can understand how those loved ones might really freeze. They might be petrified. They might be significantly denying that something serious is happening and that they need to act. And if they think about or have had some training, they might be worried that if they do something and they shouldn't have done something, they might cause harm. And at home, it's very unlikely that an automated external defibrillator will get there. And it's often, for instance, in an apartment block, that it takes longer for ambulance to get there. So how often does this actually happen? Well, in Canada, about 35 to 36,000 times a year, sudden unexpected cardiac death befalls somebody. That's about 100 times a day. In British Columbia, maybe 20 times a day that happens. And if you think about your own community, that translates into about 1.4 events per every 100,000 people in your community every year. So if you think about if you're 5,000 community or 10,000, if you're 10,000 people in your community, it's about 14 times a year that event will happen. And that is more than the deaths from COVID and the opioid crisis combined. We hear a lot about those. They're very important, extremely important. We don't hear as much about the epidemic of sudden cardiac death that's been going on for, well, forever, basically. And so it's time to change that. So it was mentioned earlier a little bit, but there's 100 people there who have a cardiac arrest. And that's how many will survive to leave hospital. We usually describe that in terms of treated cardiac arrest. So what you saw was 100, about 50 of those. Actually, we don't even start to treat because we get there too late. It's unwitnessed. Maybe an hour later, it may be a day later, it may be a week later that these people are discovered. And so we don't even try to resuscitate them. At least the ambulance service doesn't even try. So if you look at the 50 that we attempt resuscitation on, that would equate to about a 12% survival rate, which in Canada, even for large communities with good functioning EMS systems, that's actually pretty good, and pretty good even related to and compared to around the world. What we're doing now is working on transformative ways, trying to change our thinking about what we can do. The common way that for 20 years, 30 years, we've been trying to make a difference with this, and we have made a difference with this, is working with ambulance personnel to make sure they do high quality CPR, trying to make sure they get there quickly, trying to train bystanders, as many as we can, in CPR, working with the ambulance dispatch center, and they now will provide help to bystanders who call in and coach them on how to do CPR. And it's important to understand that even with all of those things, only about 60% of the time do we have bystanders treating in the cases where we actually do go to a full-blown resuscitation attempt. And if bystanders do apply CPR early, the survival is 2 to 3 times what it is if they don't do that CPR. And it's even more, it's even higher if they're able to apply an AED, which is relatively rare at this point. If we could get everybody, every time, to be able to do that, we could make a substantial difference. When we talk to survivors, they often say, I was very lucky. I was very lucky that the person that was with me knew CPR and acted. I was very lucky that an AED was handy for somebody to use early. I was very lucky that the ambulance service was able to come relatively quickly. One of our mottos that we have is, why are some people lucky and some people not? We want to take the luck out of it. We want to make sure that whenever this happens, that we can provide that response. And it's not an easy thing. It's not like working in an emergency department or a critical care department where patients are in front of you and you can do all those things. When these things happen, the reason unexpected is an important word there, is that People don't wake up that day thinking, oh, I'm going to have a cardiac arrest today. They wake up thinking their life is going to go on as normal. And that's what the sudden unexpected part of it is about. And it can happen anywhere to anybody. So I'm going to hand it over now with that sort of introduction to what the event looks like over to my good friend, Scott.
All right, thanks, Jim. As Jim has just shown, early and effective CPR is crucial to increasing the chance of surviving a cardiac arrest. Indeed, research has shown that for every minute a cardiac arrest victim is without CPR, their chances of survival decrease by 10%. Community responders save lives. While emergency response times have been creeping downward across Canada generally, there are still areas where response times can be quite long. For instance, in rural areas of southwestern Ontario, where I live, an ambulance might be 15 to 20 minutes away, and that's at best. And even in high-density urban centers such as Toronto or Vancouver, actual response times can also be quite lengthy, especially when emergency responders need to navigate security doors, climb elevators, climb stairs, and travel up 25 or more floors in an elevator. It simply takes time, and time is of the essence. To put it bluntly, a penthouse is not the place where you want to be if you go into cardiac arrest, unless you have neighbors nearby who can respond with CPR and ideally with an AED. Okay, there we go. Surviving sudden cardiac arrest depends on a series of events, beginning with someone calling 911. Sometimes referred to as the chain of survival, the next link in the chain after calling for help is CPR. As Jim mentioned, traditionally this link has meant high-quality CPR done by professionally trained emergency responders. In practical terms, though, we know that survival most often depends on a bystander starting CPR as soon as possible and ideally using an AED. This infographic from CanSave, a research cluster headed up by Jim at UBC and aimed at increasing sudden cardiac death survival rates, shows the crucial link that community bystanders play in saving a life. So you'll notice looking at the infographic there, it is on the far left-hand side, which is sort of the immediate part that community responders can play. And it is here I would like to pose a question to you. What can we do, and by we, I mean all of us, to actually increase the chance of survival by decreasing the time between an individual collapsing with a sudden cardiac arrest and having someone else providing CPR and defibrillation? To help you answer that question, I want to briefly talk with you about an approach that is sometimes referred to as community first response to sudden cardiac arrest. It is an approach that empowers lay community members to respond to sudden cardiac arrest first, while EMS, firefighters, and other emergency responders are on their way. So, how do we get community responder programs in place? First, we need to tell people what it is. On the one hand, this sounds easy. It's a program that is intended to reach a victim of sudden cardiac arrest as quickly as possible and begin CPR. On the other hand, it's not so easy. One of the fundamental challenges facing community first response programs is communicating the objectives and details of the program in language that makes sense. Too often, CPR training sounds too technical, too medical, too procedural, and too far removed from the layperson's everyday life. When we use this type of overly clinical language, we unwittingly communicate the message that saving a life belongs to trained health and medical professionals. This mismessaging can act as a barrier to community first responder programs because at a foundational level, community response programs are most successful when a significant part of the population is trained in basic, and I would say simple, hands-only CPR, and how to use an AED. Second, we need to support members of our community who are hesitant to start CPR because they're afraid they might do it wrong or might hurt somebody. As Jim has already mentioned, this is especially true for family members who are struggling with a wide range of emotions or who may not be able to assess the reality of a family member in cardiac arrest. While we need to be sensitive to these very real concerns, the reality is that that person has no pulse. They will remain dead without CPR. And third, we also need to do a better job of allaying concerns that people have that performing CPR on a person may expose the bystander to legal liability. Here we could use some help from the legal experts in our communities who can speak to the Good Samaritan laws that are in place to protect bystanders from legal liability. One of the most challenging questions we face is how best to encourage members of the community to participate in community first initiatives. Let me start with the way we invite members to participate. Again, we must not use unnecessarily technical or clinical language, which can be intimidating and a barrier. Instead, we should use plain language that speaks to the community and its culture. Let me give you an example. The Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation has been promoting the idea that a lay bystander can save a life by using hands-only CPR, compressing at around 100 to 120 beats per minute, while singing along to the Bee Gees disco tune, Staying Alive. This approach, which uses 4 simple steps, and the 4th step was actually added because of the COVID pandemic, but using this approach, which uses 4 simple steps, it also uses playful pop cultural references. This not only demystifies CPR, but subtly invites us to respond with potentially life-saving action. A more complex challenge is identifying larger motivating narratives that help community members frame their role in responding positively to victims of sudden cardiac arrest. Because these motivational narratives often belong to larger cultural, national, and religious stories, they can often help members of the community ascribe meaning to their action and overcome any fear they have, and their lack of confidence, and any hesitations that they may have in responding to somebody in need of life-saving help. So, what do these motivating narratives look like? For many of us, the narrative that might first come to mind is the parable of the Good Samaritan, which we find in the Gospel of Luke. It is a story that Jesus tells to a clever legal scholar who asks, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus prompts the scholar to give the correct answer in accord with Jewish law. Love your neighbor as yourself. But the legal scholar isn't fully satisfied with the answer, so he asks Jesus another question. And who is my neighbor? Jesus tells the story of a man along the road, half dead, the victim of an assault. A priest doesn't just come by the injured man without helping him, but he actually crosses to the other side of the road to avoid him. And then a Levite walks by, and he too decides to cross to the other side of the road to avoid him. Finally, a Samaritan, a despised outsider in this close-knit religious community, sees the injured man, is moved by compassion, and comes to the aid of the victim. Not only does the Samaritan provide immediate care, but he also ensures that the man is cared for in the longer term. And he gives the innkeeper money to be used to nurse the man back to health. The story ends with Jesus asking a question of the legal scholar. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The scholar says, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus replies, go and do likewise. The parable of the Samaritan is an apt motivating narrative because it actually speaks to the hopes and challenges we face in community-first response programs. On the one hand, the parable is a story about a lay bystander, the Samaritan, who goes out of his way, crossing not the street, but crossing cultural and religious convention by coming to the aid of a half-dead victim that is not essentially his neighbor, but becomes his neighbor. We can surmise that without the Samaritan's helping hand, the outcome might not have been as positive. In this respect, the parable is about doing right, doing the right thing, the virtuous thing, recognizing the dignity of the victim, responding with mercy and compassion, and acting on the moral imperative, love your neighbor. But the parable isn't just about doing. It is also about being. In this case, being in an expanded, inclusive community that pursues the common good. This is a point made recently by Pope Francis in his 2020 encyclical Fratelli Tutti on fraternity and social friendship. Francis writes, "Let us look to the example of the Good Samaritan. Jesus' parable summons us to rediscover our vocation as citizens of our respective nations and of the entire world, builders of a new social bond. This summons is ever new, yet it is grounded in a fundamental law of our being. We are called to direct society to the pursuit of the common good, and with this purpose in mind, to persevere in consolidating its political and social order, its fabric of relations, its human goals. By his actions, the Good Samaritan showed that the existence of each and every individual is deeply tied to that of others. Life is not simply time that passes. Life is a time for interactions." So let me give an example of a community first program that is currently being developed in 2 locations in Ontario. One in Frontenac County, which is where Kingston, Ontario is, also the home of Queen's University, and another in Perth County, which is where the city of Stratford is. It is an approach called Neighbor Saving Neighbor, or Neighbors Saving Neighbors. The Frontenac Neighbor Saving Neighbors program is being spearheaded by Dr. Stephen Brooks, an emergency physician and a member of the Department of Emergency Medicine at Queen's University, while I am helping kickstart the pilot in Perth County. Neighbor Saving Neighbors is a unique community response program in that it recruits volunteers to be a part of the program. Working with stakeholders, it trains these volunteers in CPR and how to use AEDs. It also equips volunteers with AEDs. In some cases, AEDs can be assigned to individuals, and in other cases, AEDs can be strategically placed in neighborhoods and properly registered. A key component of Neighbor Saving Neighbor programs is the use of technology, such as a phone app, to dispatch community responders to the scene. This use of technology to dispatch community responders is important because it can further reduce the time between collapse and resuscitation measures. There are, of course, a number of obstacles that arise when trying to implement a new way of responding to cardiac arrest or giving a helping hand to your neighbor. Let me name 4. First, we have the social and cultural obstacles that I've named earlier. There is still some reluctance in our communities to get CPR and AED training and to step forward as a potential community responder. Again, if community first response programs like Neighbor Saving Neighbor are going to work well, we need a renewed culture, one that focuses on the common good and one where lay bystanders and volunteers, all of us, are empowered to help a victim of sudden cardiac arrest. Second, there are real structural concerns, especially as they relate to coordinating dispatch. A community response program cannot, it must not, create barriers that would delay emergency response professionals from arriving on the scene. Adding another step in the dispatcher's protocol by triggering the community response app is not really an option. Removing this obstacle may entail integrating the dispatch systems, which would require software systems to talk to one another, or creating a separate but also parallel response structure in the dispatch office, one aimed at EMS and the other, one aimed at EMS and fire response, while the other focuses on the community response. There remains much work to be done in this area. Third, identifying and mobilizing Neighbor Saving Neighbor champions is crucial to the success of the program. Service organizations are likely among the most eager to lend their leadership and support. Elected officials have also been extraordinarily supportive. Perhaps most importantly, champions need to be the insiders, that is, the people who work with EMS, the firefighters, and the dispatchers. Here we need the support and leadership of provincial officials responsible for emergency health services. And fourth, we need venues and opportunities to recount stories of community responders stepping in to save a life. Here we need the support of churches, synagogues, other religious organizations, as well as service clubs and retirement groups to help enrich the narratives supporting Neighbor Saving Neighbor. So, on a personal note, I am a victim of a sudden cardiac arrest, which was brought on by a heart attack, the culprit being a 99% blockage of the right coronary artery. On Saturday, June 9th, 2018, I told my wife, I don't feel well. She was about to leave for the afternoon. I was going to stay home with my two young boys who were 6 and 4 at the time. Before leaving, she peeked into the living room where I had sat down. I was slumped over. She went to work. She tried to hail our neighbors, who are, by the way, physicians. They weren't home. A construction worker we know, who just happened to be in the neighborhood, heard my wife say, "Scott's having a heart attack." He rushed in the house to help. Another neighbor heard the commotion and came over to see what he could do. In the midst of the chaos and confusion, my wife called 911. As one of the neighbors was coming into the house, he saw the physician neighbor coming up the street. He told her I was in trouble. She rushed in and checked for a pulse. There was none. My neighbors got me down on the ground. Within 2 minutes of my collapse, she began chest compressions. She continued for the next 15 minutes as the fire department showed up with an AED and then the ambulance. I was shocked twice by the AED to no avail. Declaring a scoop and run, they loaded me into the ambulance. On the way to the hospital, my heart began beating again. The next few days were difficult for my family. One of the major concerns was whether the cardiac arrest had resulted in damage to my brain. Thankfully, the CPR and resuscitation measures kept the oxygen flowing to my brain. As far as I know, I didn't have any brain damage. I then started on my journey back to health, celebrating my life with my family, my many neighbors who stepped in that day, and my friends. And here I just want to pick up on something Jim said. People will talk about my survival as though using the term, it was a miracle. I've said in a number of places that ascribing it to the miraculous doesn't really do justice to the hard work and training that the physicians, the EMS, and even in some cases, the neighbors did. If we can begin mounting these community first programs, and essentially, what we're essentially doing is creating a miracle for someone by having somebody in the community come forward and save a life. That really, I believe, is our goal. So finally, before I turn it back over to Jim, I want to leave you with a quote from Pope Francis. He says this in Fratelli Tutti: "Each day we have to decide whether to be a good Samaritan or indifferent bystanders. And if we extend our gaze to the history of our own lives and that of the entire world, all of us are or have been like each of the characters in the parable. All of us have in ourselves something of the wounded man, something of the robber, something of the passersby, and something of the Good Samaritan. My hope is that we choose the way of the Samaritan. I am grateful that my neighbor did. She saved my life. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jim, who will talk about some of the great work that is going on over on the island of Vancouver. Jim, it's all yours.
Thank you, Scott. You can hear me okay? We're good. And thank you for sharing that personal story. I'm sure it does trigger some emotions that you were very much in control of, but that kind of an event is so important for people to really understand. And Scott is one of the lucky ones. We wanted to share with you some work that we're doing on the west coast of Vancouver Island with 4 remote Indigenous communities. And they're listed there, Cayuquit, Heshquit, Ahousaht, and Tla'que'it. This project is funded by the federal government, by the Institute of Indigenous Peoples Health, and it's called Quis Hen Neep, which the name was given by an elder, and that just simply means change. And it's such a powerful name to me because the need for that to change what happens in those communities is profound. In those communities, there is no hospital. There may be a nursing station. One of them has 24/7 nurses. The others have nurses coming in maybe once or twice a week. Physicians coming in even less. So most of the time, if an event happens in that community, it's a first responder who actually, a community first responder, who actually can go and try to help the person. And if you imagine that first responder, even if they have a certificate of first response, which is even more than the community responders we might be talking about in the Neighbor Saving Neighbors program, that's about 15 days of medical training. And that's the most advanced person that can respond in that community. And it is not just minor things that happen in those communities. That community can see a major stroke, a cardiac arrest, a major trauma, the same kind of patient that comes into Vancouver General Hospital, a big trauma center, can happen in those communities. And the first responder is the only person there that can help. Emergencies like cardiac arrest happen anywhere, anytime. This is an aerial view of Heshquit. You can see the community. There's less than 100 people there. There's no roads in or out. It's about a 2-hour boat ride or a little bit more to get to Tofino, which is the closest hospital, which doesn't even have a CT scanner, but that's the referral center. And if it's rough weather, if it's stormy, they have to go out on the open ocean to get down to Tofino. They can't go at all. So to get somebody to get Coast Guard to come in or whatever is a very, very big deal. So in that community, there's rarely a physician and rarely a nurse. So we started out a couple of years ago by trying to understand the care that was being given. And it was remarkable. It was very eye-opening to me. It was like third world medicine for much of the time in those communities. So we talked with the communities about what exists, what happens when you have an emergency, and we helped to try to define those discussions into what are the themes, what are the most important things that we could do to try to strengthen the emergency response, including the response to cardiac arrest. And we landed on 4 themes, pardon me. The first one was we need to really support first responders. They were burned out. They often left the job. It was a volunteer position. So how can we support them with better training and better ways to make sure their work and their job is not burning them out? The second was community readiness. How can we get the community ready with some basic first aid, some basic CPR training, so that when the first responder does respond, there's already some things happening and they can actually help the first responder. Third was to improve the communication infrastructure. In many of these communities, they may have good Wi-Fi, but not good cellular or vice vice versa. When we started doing this, most of the time the reliable communication around the community was just by VHF radio. And so how do we strengthen that so we can get help at least virtually into the community from afar? And the last was, it often was a very complex process if somebody really needed to get out in a hurry to do it, and it was impossible to get somebody out in a hurry. There had to be a lot of steps that went, can we actually make that easier? So we're working on all of those themes to try to improve them. One of them that relates specifically to what we're talking about today is that we're trying to enhance the skill within the community to do CPR. We're trying to get the whole community to be responsive and understand it. In fact, we want to do it in a very special way. We want to create a teaching video. Initially, the thought was we want to teach kids in the schools CPR, but we want to broaden that to the whole community. And because this project really, we strive very hard, and I think we're successful at that, in not sort of bringing in our ideas to sort of lay on top of the Indigenous community. It's driven by the community in a very culturally safe manner. So we spend a lot of time talking with the community members, with elders, with traditional healers, with the first responders to say, you know, what can we do? What can we do to facilitate the things that together we can bring and strengthen in the community? So we're going to build something that's never existed before, a CPR training video that is Indigenous actors. One of our medical students is leading this. She's a CPR instructor. She's Indigenous herself. We're going to film it in Indigenous communities. We're going to be talking and get interviews from elders and from traditional healers in that to sort of set the stage for that. And it's going to be filmed by an Indigenous video production company. So we're very proud of that. I'd hope to be able to tell you how that had gone, because we were going to film 3 weeks ago. Unfortunately, 3 weeks ago, COVID cases started to rise in their communities, and we were asked not to come in. And so we've postponed it until COVID settles down again a little bit so we can safely come in and be welcomed. So we wanted to let you know that that is a special case, and we're going to be in that culture. Things might be different about how we approach it, but to truly having the community respond, because there is no other option. And there's no ambulance on the way, except maybe hours and hours away. So Scott, I will hand that back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Just very quickly, we've probably gone a little bit over time, but just want to leave you with a couple of takeaways. Went the wrong way here. So, okay, now we're going back and rehearsing things. This is interesting. There we go. So first takeaway is immediate bystander CPR is the most effective therapy for sudden cardiac death. Second, the Good Samaritan philosophy incorporates us all in the healthcare response to out-of-hospital emergencies. Healthcare professionals cannot always be there to take care of us. Third, we need to change the culture and build facilitating frameworks to optimize community health, helping hands in all of our communities, including our traditionally underserved. I want to thank you all for taking your time and for being with us this afternoon. And I can speak for Jim and look forward to hearing your questions.
Okay. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Jim. And for each of your different perspectives, weaving together the clinical and academic and theologian themes and perspectives on this topic. So I have a couple of questions for you myself, just to get us started, and I'll bring in the questions from the audience as well. So if there are those of you watching and you have some additional questions, please do feel free to post them, and then we'll try to get them in our remaining time. But the question that I have, just first of all, I'll pose it to both of you, is this lecture focuses on personally resident and impactful stories at that individual level. And Scott, thank you for sharing your personal experience of yourself and your wife as well. And it also talks about this an important social problem at a community level. as well as the related opportunities for change. And that was interesting, Jim. You mentioned that the name for the initiative translates to change. So what are your thoughts, each of you, on how this motivating approach could be expanded to other areas? We're talking about sudden cardiac arrest here today. So does this translate beyond sudden cardiac arrest responses? Are there similar fears or challenges in motivating a bystander to act in other areas? I'll open that up to either of you.
I'll go quickly. So the answer is certainly. I think if we, just going back to the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's not just about responding to a person in sort of healthcare crisis. It's talking about people who are sort of at the margins of society, people who are being underserved, whether that's in education, again, healthcare, nutrition, a variety of other areas. You can also expand it, which Pope Francis has done, to environment, that you have people who are living in toxic environments. And just talking about the stewardship that we owe to creation. So yeah, there's definitely ways in which we can think of the community responder as being a leader and taking initiative to make change. And that's really where this is coming from. It's as much as anything, what's coming out of the reading of the parable of the Good Samaritan is it's a cultural shift, a community shift that has to take place, where there's this recognition that we are not just self-interested individuals, but we are a part of a group of people who are pursuing the common good.
Yeah, and if I might just add to that, if you look at it purely from the medical event perspective, there are other types of medical events where community members could really make a big difference. And the more time-sensitive things are, of course, the more urgent it is, and the more difficult it is to put that kind of response into place. So it happens within minutes, for instance, in cardiac arrest. But for traumas, for bleeding, for instance, for the ability just to understand what to do when somebody might have a seizure, you don't know what's going on. It's very simple stuff, simple first aid. But even if there's not something you can do to actually affect the medical care, patients are often very frightened and alone when those events happen, and just to be there to comfort them and not be afraid to go and be there with them and help and call an ambulance, to know how to do those simple things. But then I think it elevates up to I think this might be what you're getting at, Jody, I'm not 100% sure, but to the whole community, but what you can do for the whole health of the community. Like, the community can be a very powerful politically driving force. Like, can we make sure that the food that's in our schools that our kids eat when they go to school is healthy? Can we make sure that, that every time it's recognized that there's an intersection where accidents are more common, that we do something to slow down the speed limits, or to put four-way stop signs in, or whatever it might be. So we can prevent some of these things from happening as well. So I think this is a part of a larger cultural shift, where the power of the community can really make a big difference in many, many ways.
That leads into a question I'm seeing on my screen here as well, but to expand on that a little bit. So the theme of this talk is neighbor saving neighbor, neighbor helping neighbor, neighbor saving neighbor. So let's think about neighbors a little bit and community a little bit. How do you get past the problem today of people not really even knowing their neighbors in many ways? It's not the 1950s anymore, the block party, leave it to Beaver, the Cleavers next door kind of neighborhood. Is it difficult to encourage this kind of community action? And are communities receptive? And in fact, are we even understanding what a community is, if I can put it up in air quotes, anymore? And, I hear from my teenagers about how someone on TikTok sees somebody else having a medical emergency, GIS locates them and sends some help on their way. So let's talk about that notion of neighbors and communities. Do we understand them, and are communities really ready to come together?
Scott, do you want to leave that one out?
Oh, sure. You're going to give me that one again, Jim, right? So, yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that social isolation is a is a problem. And again, I think that what we're advocating for is a new understanding of community, one that is inclusive, that it's inviting people in to participate in ways that not only benefit the individual, but benefit the collective. This is not necessarily going to change overnight, but you do have, even in some of, in times of COVID, you do have groups of people who form together around certain shared visions, shared interests, and so on. Those organically formed groups can spin off into other sort of socially positive ventures, like saving someone's life. Everyone is likely going to need some help at some point, and there may not always be a healthcare provider to be there. And so it really is, whether you're operating from a self-interested individual perspective or you're looking from the common good, it is in everyone's interests that you move beyond the social isolation and get in and work together to increase survival rates. So it is a problem, but I think it can be overcome when you work together toward a common goal.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think we need to think very broadly and creatively about what defines a community. Like a community can be, we think about it initially as it's a little town, right? And that's our community. And what is the response, and how do we enhance that with community members? But it could be a large apartment block. Now, if you imagine, so say I have a defibrillator at home, I keep it at home, and I live in a different kind of setting. But say I lived in a large apartment block, and say the person in the apartment next to me is having a cardiac arrest, and there's somebody in there trying to do CPR and has called the ambulance. Say we're 20 stories up, that's a very, very low survival, because it takes the professionals time to get into the building, get up the elevator, do all that sort of stuff, even once they arrive at the scene. And I'm happily sitting there watching The Lord of the Rings on TV, which I watched last night, so it's good. And I have no idea that that's even going on. But I'm happy to help as long as I know. And so there's some technological things that we can play, and Scott mentioned this. So there's a program called Pulse Point that actually, when the ambulance thinks that they're going to a cardiac arrest, they can trigger a response with an address to those that have registered with Pulse Point and are willing to respond. And so you already have, I think, a group of people within the community who would do this. And now, if I'm on Pulse Point and I know, oh my gosh, that's in the apartment right next door to me, I'm going to go bang on the door and help, because that apartment, it's going to take a while for ambulance to get there. And that actually is what we're talking about. But I'm a medical provider, so I'm not a lay citizen. But if you think about, as we start these programs, the people that are likely to come to be the initial members who want to embrace this are often going to be people with some medical training. So they're going to be paramedics, nurses, docs, firefighters, lifesavers, who already have good CPR training, already are in the helping business, who can be the core of those community responders. And that can generate, and then they can be champions, and they can help train other people, and gradually we can build the movement. But I don't think we should think about it nihilistically, as if we're starting from scratch with a whole bunch of people who are afraid to respond, because within our communities, there are those who would be happy to respond, but they just don't have the organizational structure and the communication structure in place to do it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And, I'm seeing questions coming in as you're talking that really are starting to hone in on that question of education and how can I get training. And keep in mind that the people watching this lecture today are a mix of clinical and non-clinical people. It could be professionally trained or not. And I've shared with the both of you in our previous discussion about the fact that I fit into that bystander category. My first experience with being faced to do CPR was when I was just 17 years old as a bystander at an accident. And I shared with the two of you that I had that same feeling, and I'm seeing it in these questions of, the fear. What do I do? What if I hurt someone? What if I hurt this person? And I struggled deeply with the confidence needed to act versus the competence of the training that I had already received. I've been trained in CPR. And I think that you're honing in on that as a potential obstacle. So I'm wondering, in these action-oriented programs that you've got, like first aid, CPR, AED training, signing up for the pulse point, what's the secret ingredient that makes the difference, that compels someone to act, a genuine bystander? Is competence enough, or is there something else?
Well, there's certainly a lot of psychological things that go on, as you just talked about briefly, and the hesitancy. There's if you take a public setting, for instance, there's denial, and any setting, there's denial, and then there's the fear that you're doing something wrong. There's the doubt that actually this person needs you to do that. And what's described in larger groups is there's a hesitancy. Often there's videos of somebody collapsing and 20 or 30 people standing around and doing nothing because everybody thinks that they're not the best trained, that somebody else should step in and do it. And nobody steps in to help. And so part of the education needs to be around those kind of complex factors. Part of the education needs to be around, be prepared for the reaction you might have after that event, because many bystanders, in fact, will have a PTSD kind of syndrome. And it doesn't happen to just those who intervened, it happens to those who failed to intervene. And, but I think that, and what we've done with recognizing those factors has been the need that's been recognized in our lay bystander CPR training programs to try to simplify it. So one of the reluctances was to do mouth-to-mouth. So for a long time, CPR was push on the chest and do mouth-to-mouth respiration. Well, for most cardiac arrest survivors, you don't actually have to do that. It's just as effective to do chest compressions only, which is much more acceptable to people. So if we can make the training, let's get the basic stuff done. If we can get the message that you can't hurt them, they are as hurt as they're ever going to be right now. You can't make it worse. You can only make it better. And even if you don't exactly know how to do perfect CPR, it's better than doing nothing. And then finally, putting in place the ability for a coach in the dispatch center to be able to help you when you're in doubt, to help you to act, to help you to keep time with the CPR, to help you use an AED if one is handy, is really revolutionary. Because now we shouldn't have people leaving a CPR course thinking, oh my gosh, I hope I can remember all this stuff. They should be leaving saying, okay, I kind of know what it feels like now, and I know that there's going to be somebody there over my shoulder with my cell phone helping me should I have to act. And so building their confidence that way from a system point of view, I think is important.
Thanks, Jim. And Scott, what do you think? Is there a secret ingredient from that spiritual or ethical perspective?
Well, I mean, it can be a motivating factor, but I think really it's just overcoming. I think intuitively many of us know that something needs to get done. I actually come from the perspective that, in the story of the Good Samaritan, purposely avoiding somebody who is in need, that takes a particular kind of person. I don't know if that's who we are. I would prefer to see us as we actually do want to help. And oftentimes it is the fears, as Jim was saying, the fears and the concerns and all those kind of things. And frankly, this sort of idea that you're not going to perform it well enough and that there's other people out there who are better than you at this. Well, it's not true. If you have the impulse to move in on somebody who is experiencing a cardiac arrest, and you know how to do hands-only CPR at 100 to 120 beats per minute, do it. Do it now and stay on it until the professionals show up. I can tell you as a survivor, the broken ribs that I received as a result of high-quality CPR healed. The bruising, it healed. The PTSD that my family arguably experienced, that's healing. What wouldn't have been healing, frankly, is had nobody been there to do anything. That is death. I am now in a position where I can return home from Vancouver to visit my family, to be with my family. And we will have a fantastic weekend together. That's what community responder programs do. Decrease the amount of time between the collapse and CPR, and increases survival, and it lets people go back home to be with their family and friends. That's what we're talking about.
I think those are powerful messages, and an answer to everyone who's saying, where can I get this training? And should I act if I'm afraid I'll hurt someone? I think what you're hearing, and certainly my learning, was you step in to help. Yes, you can make a difference. Just take the initiative. Even if you make the scene safe and call for help, you're doing something good. If you break the ribs, you're helping the person. You step in. Lots and lots of training. In my own personal experience, after what I described, I went on to take new training. I became a first aid instructor trainer. It changed my life. I went on to get involved in extensive training programs delivered to communities. So you can step in and act, and build your confidence. And that would be a message I'd want everyone to hear. Lots of courses that you can take as well. So don't be afraid. You're hearing that from everyone. I've got about 2 minutes left to ask another question that I've got here. And Jim, I'm just going to pose this one to you to circle back to the training that you were doing in Cayuga and Housekeeping with the Indigenous communities. Were there any personal learnings that you gained when you were doing that work? And I saw Dr. Jeff Redding in one of those photos as well, who has done, it continues to do extensive, terrific work with Providence Healthcare as well. Did you take some personal learnings away from that work? And then we'll have to wrap.
Okay. So we're moving along slowly. We haven't we've arranged the training. It's about to happen with the first responders, bringing new first responders in. So it's not really about me stepping in doing the training personally, but I tell the communities when we meet, and we haven't been able to meet face to face, but we have a lot of Zoom meetings too, is that so far I have taken more out of the project than I've given back. And I hope that through the evolution of this project, that I will be able to give back through the structure of this quotes research. I don't describe it as research to them. I describe we're going to improve care. The only research piece is we're going to document what we do so we can help others, and because we'll figure out what works and what doesn't. But so if there was one thing that stands out to me, it's being involved with traditional healers, because I come from a Western base of medicine. And when I think about crash emergencies like cardiac arrest, I think, well, we know what to do in cardiac arrest. We know what saves lives. Like, what would be the role of traditional healing in that kind of thing? And so I kept asking myself that question. And we ended up in a place which was really fantastic. So we were meeting with traditional healers, and one of the senior guys was very well respected. Senior elders guys said, let me tell you a story. I got really sick, and he'd been a traditional healer his whole life, taught by his grandmother. And he said, I got really sick and I went into hospital, and I was really in a bad way. And I couldn't get myself well, and I was angry. And a traditional healer, an elder, came in to talk to me, and he helped me heal my spirit. And it wasn't until he helped me heal my spirit that I could work on helping to heal my body and working with the medical professionals to do so. And I did so and was able to get over it. And that made me think about how short-sighted we are in Western medicine. And so the role for traditional healers is surprising to me. It's come out. One is to make sure that they support the first responders with body, mind, and spirit for after they've had some crushing kinds of events and emotional events, help them to heal, because they do really feel the PTSD that comes from some of this stuff. Secondly, it was to actually, within our training programs, to help the first responders understand traditional healing so they can take that concept of mind, body, and spirit, not just fixing a broken leg, to the patient and help to improve that and do it in a legitimate way that is through two-eyed seeing and using a combination of Western and traditional healing methods. So yeah, I've learned a lot. It's been one of the true joys of my life so far in a pretty long career in medicine.
Thank you. And I think those are really good words for us to close on. Both of you have shared so much of yourselves in today's talk, and This has been an important and thoughtful conversation. I hope it's resonated with everybody who has been watching and listening and joining us here today. I want to extend our deepest appreciation to Scott and Jim for sharing your time and insights with us. And special thanks to our supporter, the Archdiocese of Vancouver and the Archbishop. It is through funding from the Archbishop's annual dinner that we are able to host these important conversations. So thank you to all of you for joining us here today. Have a good day.
It's my pleasure.